Imagine stepping into ancient Egypt, not as a pharaoh swanning about in golden regalia, nor as a high priest muttering mystical hymns to Anubis, but as a perfectly ordinary citizen searching for work. Forget CVS, cover letters, and awkward job interviews in fluorescent-lit offices. Instead, picture yourself wandering through a bustling Egyptian marketplace, sandals slapping against the dusty ground, while traders shout over the bleating of goats and the hiss of frying fish. You're hungry, sweaty, and a little desperate. You need a career, something to keep bread and beer on the table, and, in this case, probably also as the actual table. Now, when most of us think about ancient Egyptian jobs, our minds leap straight to the obvious ones. The pyramid builders, the embalmers, maybe the scribes scribbling away in neat hieroglyphs on papyrus scrolls. But here's the twist: ancient Egypt was also absolutely brimming with bizarre occupations that make modern jobs look positively sensible. Forget the data analyst war, influencer, how about professional crocodile feeder, royal armpit sniffer, or collector of dung for fuel? Yes, these were real jobs, held by real people, who probably went home at night to their mud brick houses muttering, "I can't believe this is how I make a living." To appreciate why some of these strange professions existed, you have to remember two key truths about Egyptian life. First, there was a civilization obsessed with order, what they called ma'at, the principle of balance, harmony, and keeping the universe ticking along without descending into chaos. Second, they were practical to the point of genius. If something needed doing, no matter how disgusting, dangerous, or undignified, someone was assigned to do it. And if possible, they made it an honorable duty, complete with rituals and even divine significance. Take, for instance, the people tasked with the daily care of sacred animals. To us, looking after a crocodile in a temple pond sounds like a nightmare internship. To them, it was a genuine religious calling. The crocodile represented the god Sobek, and therefore feeding it chickens, massaging it with oils, or wrapping it in linen like a tiny, murderous pharaoh was part of keeping the cosmos in balance. You didn't just fling it a fish and leg it. No, there was ceremony, devotion, and probably quite a lot of fear involved. Imagine explaining that job to your children. Yes, darling, Mummy spends her day rubbing scented oils into a crocodile's scaly back so the sun keeps rising. But before we dive into crocodile care and other peculiar posts, let's sketch out the wider Egyptian job market. Most ordinary folk were farmers, laborers, and craft workers. Bread and beer, the dietary staples, demanded vast teams of workers to sow, harvest, grind, and bake. Construction required endless manpower, not just for the pyramids, but for temples, irrigation canals, and entire cities. And weaving cloth, making pottery, carving furniture, and brewing beer all had their practitioners. These jobs weren't glamorous, but they kept society afloat. The weird jobs tended to crop up at the edges of this system, either tied to religion, where symbolism turned the mundane into the divine, or in urban settings, where unusual demands called for equally unusual solutions. For example, embalming required a whole team of specialists, from those who delicately removed organs to others whose job was, quite literally, pouring resin into skulls. Some drew the short straw and became brain removers, sliding hooks up through the nose to fish out the grey matter of the dearly departed. Not exactly a career path your careers advisor would suggest with a straight face, but someone had to do it. Then there were the professions tied to the whims of the elite. Pharaohs and nobles required armies of servants, each with a narrowly defined duty. One person's job might be to fan the ruler with ostrich feathers for hours on end. Another's sole responsibility was to hold and guard the pharaoh's sandals. Yes, a grown adult making a living by ensuring a pair of shoes didn't wander off. And yet, because proximity to power mattered in Egypt, these seemingly menial jobs could be surprisingly prestigious. After all, you were close enough to overhear palace gossip and maybe slip into favor with the right smile at the right time. Hygiene in a hot climate also generated peculiar posts. Bathing was infrequent, perfumes were everywhere, and body odor was a constant menace. As a result, some unfortunate souls found themselves in the role of testers, sniffing oils, perfumes, and sometimes the armpits of the wealthy to check whether the scent was up to scratch. Imagine clocking in each morning knowing your nose was your main professional asset. And unlike a modern perfumer in Paris, you weren't developing Chanel No. 5. You were trying not to gag while pressing your face into your employer's sweaty linen tunic. Even waste had its workforce. Egyptians used animal dung as fuel, fertilizer, and even building material. Entire families specialized in collecting, drying, and distributing it. Today, we politely refer to waste management professionals. Back then, you were simply the dung collector, tramping about with baskets and little dignity. But crucially, this was necessary work. Without them, fields would go barren, kilns would go cold, and yes, even mummification fires would sputter out. And then there were the entertainers. Ancient Egyptian banquets often included dancers, musicians, and storytellers, but some performers had particularly odd gigs. Dwarfs, for instance, were held in special regard and often hired as entertainers or guardians of jewelry. They were believed to have magical connections, so their presence was both amusing and protective. In a similar vein, acrobats, jugglers, and even trained monkeys filled roles that, while not jobs in our sense, were very much paid and appreciated. So, what unites all these unusual professions? At their core, they tell us something important about Egyptian society. No task was too strange to be ritualized, sanctified, or monetized. Whether it was embalming brains, massaging crocodiles, or sniffing aristocratic armpits, each job slotted neatly into the machinery of a civilization determined to keep the gods happy, the pharaoh alive, and the beer flowing. In the next part, we'll explore one of the most iconic and gruesome of these roles, the embalmers, and specifically the poor souls who had to deal with the messier aspects of mummification. If you thought modern medical interns had it bad, wait until you hear what the Egyptians expected of their mortuary staff. If there was ever a job in ancient Egypt that managed to be both utterly fascinating and stomach-churningly horrific, it was embalming. Forget the romantic Hollywood image of priests solemnly wrapping linen while chanting in candlelight. The real embalmers were more like ancient forensic technicians crossed with butchers, working in smoky workshops filled with the pungent stench of resins, bitumen, and, let's be blunt, human leakage. Yet, bizarrely enough, this profession was one of the most respected in the land. After all, what could be more important than preparing a body for eternity? the Egyptians believed that death was not the end but a beginning, a transition to the afterlife where the soul, or ka, required a properly preserved vessel to function. Botch the job, and you risked not just your client's eternal happiness, but also your own reputation. No pressure then, especially when your client was a pharaoh with the divine right of rule and a rather short temper in life. Now, embalming was not a one-man operation. It was a team sport, with each worker assigned a specialized role. Think of it as an assembly line, only instead of churning out Model Ts, you were producing durable corpses. At the top were the chief embalmers, often priests, who performed the rituals and ensured that the gods were suitably placated while the grisly work unfolded. Beneath them were various specialists, the organ removers, the linen wrappers, the resin pourers, and, perhaps the most unlucky of all, the brain extractors. Yes, you heard that correctly. In order to mummify someone properly, the soft tissue inside the skull had to go. And since sawing open heads was seen as both messy and undignified, the Egyptians devised a technique that was equal parts ingenious and grotesque. A thin hook, usually made of bronze, was inserted up through the nostril, pushed through the cribriform plate of the skull, and then used to mash up the brain into a less than appetizing slurry. This was then allowed to drain out, sometimes helped along by gravity, other times by further stirring. Imagine spending your working day swirling someone's frontal lobe like a bartender mixing a questionable cocktail. One can only imagine the recruitment process. Do you have steady hands? A strong stomach? A willingness to shove bits of metal into corpses' noses? Congratulations, you're hired. For most of us, this sounds like the stuff of nightmares, but in Egypt it was a genuine career path, handed down through families. Sons often followed their fathers into the embalming trade, learning the fine art of nasal excavation as though it were carpentry or pottery. Imagine your father proudly demonstrating the correct wrist flick needed to dislodge grey matter. Family bonding at its finest. What's interesting is that, despite the grimness, this job came with surprising prestige. Embalmers were both feared and revered. On one hand, their work was sacred, guided by ritual, and essential for the afterlife. On the other, they were constantly handling corpses, which in Egyptian culture meant they were unclean. This made them something of a paradox, spiritual technicians necessary for eternity, yet also viewed with a slight social suspicion. One might imagine dinner parties where guests subtly edged their stools a little further away from the embalmer, muttering about lingering odors of frankincense and decomposing royalty. But the embalming team wasn't just about brains. They also had the delightful task of organ removal. The stomach, intestines, lungs, and liver were carefully extracted, dried, and placed into canopic jars, each guarded by a protective deity. The heart, believed to be the seat of the soul, was usually left in place, unless someone made an error in judgment. Mistakes did happen. Imagine turning up at the gates of the afterlife only to find your heart had been stuffed in the wrong jar by an apprentice on his first day. Another curious duty was the pouring of resin and melted bitumen into body cavities. This acted as both preservative and filler, giving the mummy that firm, lifelike shape we still see today in museum displays. So yes, some workers literally spent their days ladling hot tree sap into corpses like a ghastly version of making jam. The wrappers, meanwhile, were artisans in their own right. Dozens of meters of linen were required, layered with amulets and charms, all tied according to complex rituals. A sloppy wrap job was not just embarrassing but could be seen as endangering the soul. "Sorry about that crooked bandage, Your Majesty, but don't worry, the gods probably won't notice." Perhaps the strangest aspect is how normalized all of this was. For embalmers, death was daily life. They worked in dedicated workshops, often near temples, and probably developed the sort of gallows humor that modern morticians know well. Picture a group of them sitting around during a break, chuckling about the latest tough case where someone's brain simply refused to come out, or a liver that popped free and landed in someone's lap. Dark, yes, but when your daily routine involves scooping organs, you either laugh or go mad. It's also worth noting that embalming wasn't for everyone. The elaborate process was expensive, affordable mainly to the elite. Poorer Egyptians received more modest burials, with bodies dried in the desert sand or preserved in simpler ways. Still, even at the lower end, there were workers whose sole task might be to stitch up a wound, patch a hole, or rub cheap oils into skin. So whether rich or poor, someone, somewhere, had to do the dirty work. What this tells us is that the ancient Egyptian labor market was deeply intertwined with religion and death. The job of embalmer wasn't just a profession, it was part of a cosmic bargain. Without them, the afterlife would grind to a halt. And while we might recoil at the thought of stirring brains through the nose, they likely viewed it as both honorable and necessary. In their eyes, this wasn't grotesque. It was the foundation of eternity. In our next part, we'll move away from the morbid world of mummification and explore something altogether more scaly, the caretakers of sacred crocodiles. If embalming was unpleasant, imagine trying to bathe, feed, and soothe a hungry reptile in the name of the gods. Yes, welcome to the Temple of Sobek, where job hazards included being eaten on the job. If embalming made you queasy, spare a thought for the poor souls whose day job involved wrangling live crocodiles. That's right, in certain corners of ancient Egypt, caring for a snarling, semi-aquatic predator wasn't a nightmare scenario or a dare gone wrong, but an actual profession. The Nile crocodile was more than a terrifying reptile lurking in the river. To the Egyptians, it was the living embodiment of Sobek, a god associated with fertility, the power of the Nile, and, rather curiously, military strength. Sobek wasn't some minor deity tucked away in an obscure shrine. He had entire cult centers, such as Crocodilopolis in the Fem, where crocodiles were raised, pampered, and treated as earthly vessels of divine power. And, naturally, if you've got divine crocodiles, you need a staff of dedicated carers. Enter the crocodile keepers, priests, attendants, and, frankly, the bravest employees in history. So what exactly did crocodile keeping involve? Well, first, there was feeding. Crocodiles in temple ponds weren't expected to hunt their own dinners. They were hand-fed with offerings, fish, ducks, and occasionally cuts of beef or even cake. Yes, cake. Archaeological evidence shows that some temple crocodiles were presented with baked goods shaped like animals. Try picturing the scene, a solemn priest lowering a pastry in the vague likeness of a goose into a crocodile's gaping jaws. Here you are, great Sobek, enjoy your ancient cupcake. Next came grooming. Crocodiles were sometimes anointed with oils and perfumes, their scales rubbed to a shine as part of ritual purification. Imagine drawing the short straw that day. Right, you're on croc massage duty. Don't forget the frankincense rub. It's hard to imagine a more stressful spa treatment. One slip, and you weren't getting tipped, you were getting bitten. Then there was the matter of adornment. Some sacred crocodiles were dressed up, quite literally, in jewelry. Archaeologists have found mummified crocodiles with gilded teeth, collars of precious stones, and even elaborate wrappings worthy of royalty. Which means that part of the crocodile keeper's job was to play stylist to a creature that could snap you in half without a second thought. And yes, bathing was also on the agenda. Sacred crocodiles weren't left to languish in stagnant water. They were moved, cleaned, and even escorted on processions. Imagine the parade logistics, banners flying, priests chanting, and in the middle, a crocodile trundling along on a litter carried by sweating attendants. If you thought walking a dog was challenging, try walking a god disguised as an irritable reptile. But the duties didn't end with life. When a sacred crocodile died, whether peacefully in its pond or mid-chomp on an unlucky handler, it was embalmed with great care. Some were mummified individually, complete with linen wrappings and painted features. Others were mummified en masse, entire caches of crocodile mummies discovered in temple catacombs. Who handled this? You guessed it, the same unlucky staff who had to wrangle them in life were also charged with preserving them in death. One imagines they preferred this phase of the job, fewer teeth to worry about. Of course, there was also danger. Crocodiles are not exactly known for their gentle temperaments. They bite, they thrash, and they can drag a grown human underwater with terrifying ease. For keepers, injury and even death were occupational hazards. Yet, paradoxically, dying at the claws of Sobek's representative might have been considered a holy sacrifice. The family could at least console themselves. Well, Uncle Horam may have been eaten, but he's probably got a direct line to Sobek now. This job also reveals something crucial about Egyptian society, their ability to sanctify even the absurd. Caring for a predator wasn't dismissed as lunacy. It was framed as divine duty, essential to maintaining balance in the universe. The keepers weren't seen as thrill-seekers or eccentrics. They were temple staff performing a necessary function in the cosmic order. Feeding a crocodile wasn't just feeding a crocodile, it was nourishing the god of fertility so the Nile would flood on time. Interestingly, this occupation wasn't isolated. The Egyptians had a habit of turning animals into divine representatives. Cats, ibises, hawks, bulls, even beetles, all had cults and caretakers. But crocodiles were arguably the most dangerous of the lot. Looking after a cat is one thing. Looking after a 5-meter-long killing machine is another. The fact that people lined up for the job shows both the depth of their religious devotion and perhaps a lack of other viable career paths. Let's be honest, if you were a peasant's son in Crocodilopolis, your options were probably limited. Work the fields, grind grain, or try your luck in the temple. And if the temple specialized in crocodiles, well, congratulations, here's your bucket of fish and a stick for fending off divine temper tantrums. Still, one has to admire the keeper's courage. They didn't have tranquilizer darts, reinforced cages, or modern safety gear. Just bare hands, ritual chants, and sheer audacity. Yet they persevered, not just for wages, but because their society believed that a happy crocodile meant a happy Nile. Without them, crops failed, famine loomed, and order collapsed. In the end, crocodile keepers embody the central theme of weird Egyptian jobs, the collision between practicality and piety. Yes, someone had to keep the crocodiles fed, but instead of relegating it to the lowest rung of society, Egypt elevated it to a priestly duty. That mixture of reverence and danger is why we remember it today, and why it stands out as one of the most bizarre career choices in history. If crocodile wrangling wasn't nerve-wracking enough, ancient Egypt had another animal-centered profession guaranteed to test your survival instincts: snake handling. Yes, amidst the sand, temples, and endless jars of beer, there were men and women whose daily work involved coaxing, controlling, and sometimes outright wrestling with cobras. And not just any cobras, the Egyptian cobra, an elegant creature with a flair for dramatic hoods and a bite capable of ending your career in a matter of minutes. Snakes slither through Egyptian culture in ways both literal and symbolic. They were feared for their venom, admired for their sleek beauty, and revered as divine creatures. The cobra, in particular, symbolized protection and power. That iconic rearing serpent you see on the brow of Pharaohs' crowns? That was the uraeus, a stylized cobra representing the goddess Wadjet, who spat fire at the pharaoh's enemies. Which means snake handlers weren't just pest control, they were part of the machinery of kingship, religion, and cosmic balance. So what did the job entail? First, there was the pragmatic side. Snakes genuinely were a nuisance. Villages stored grain, and where there's grain, there are rodents. Where there are rodents, snakes happily follow. Having someone skilled at capturing and relocating snakes was, therefore, essential. Not every cobra was a goddess in disguise. Sometimes it was just a cranky reptile lurking near your granary. Cue the snake handler, equipped with little more than a stick, a basket, and possibly a quick prayer. Then there was the ritual side. Snake charmers were often linked to temple life, using chants, music, and ritual movements to control serpents. Was this real mesmerism, or simply performance mixed with experience? Hard to say. But from the Egyptian point of view, the spectacle of a man apparently subduing a cobra with nothing but a reed pipe and a steady stare was proof of divine favor. Handling snakes was seen as a sacred skill, a visible demonstration that order, Ma'at, could triumph over chaos, Isfet. And yes, performances likely played a role. Banquets, festivals, and temple gatherings often featured entertainers. What better way to impress guests than having someone pull a cobra from a basket, sway it about, and somehow not end up dead? It's the ancient equivalent of juggling chainsaws, equal parts terror and fascination. Imagine the whispered commentary, "That's extraordinary, he hasn't been bitten yet." Place your bets, ladies and gentlemen. But while the entertainment angle might make it sound frivolous, snake handlers also held an important medical adjacent role. Snake bites were a real threat, and some handlers doubled as healers, versed in charms and remedies for venom. The Ebers Papyrus, a medical text from around 1550 BCE, contains recipes for treating snake bites, mixtures of honey, resin, and incantations. So, the snake handler might not only catch the creature but also recite the necessary spells or brew the poultice if someone had an unfortunate encounter. In a world without antivenom, that kind of knowledge could mean the difference between life and death. Of course, the risks were immense. Unlike crocodiles, which could at least be distracted with food or bound with ropes, snakes are small, fast, and unpredictable. One wrong move, and you're twitching on the ground while your colleagues debate whether to bury you as a martyr to Wadjet or simply mutter, well, that's another vacancy to fill. The job demanded steady nerves, quick reflexes, and perhaps a touch of fatalism. Interestingly, there may have been a magical component to this career path. Some Egyptians believed snake handlers possessed special powers, a sort of immunity to venom. Was this superstition, or did they develop real techniques for avoiding bites, perhaps milking snakes of venom, or training with less deadly species before graduating to cobras? Whatever the case, the aura of mystery helped bolster their status. They weren't just animal wranglers. They were liminal figures who straddled the line between life, death, and divine protection. Let's not forget that snakes also had a darker role in Egyptian mythology. The monstrous serpent Apophis, or Apep, was the eternal enemy of the sun god Ra, trying every night to devour the solar bark as it sailed through the underworld. Priests enacted rituals to subdue Apophis, chanting spells, spitting, stabbing effigies, and burning them to symbolically kill the serpent over and over again. In a sense, every snake handler participated in this grand cosmic drama, standing in for the forces of order beating back the chaos embodied by serpents. Daily life for a snake handler probably oscillated between the mundane and the terrifying. One morning, you might be hauling snakes out of a bakery storeroom while a baker shrieked and waved floury hands. That afternoon, you could be part of a temple ritual, playing your reed pipe while a cobra swayed ominously before a crowd of chanting priests. And at night, you might be patching up someone's snakebite with honey and spells, muttering about hazard pay that didn't exist. We might chuckle at the absurdity of choosing such a job, but it was a genuine career path. Just like crocodile keepers, snake handlers provided an essential service cloaked in religious symbolism. They were guardians, healers, and entertainers rolled into one. And while their tools were primitive, their courage was immense. So next time you hear a snake charmer's tune in some tourist marketplace, remember, the tradition may well trace its roots back to the banks of the Nile, where ancient handlers risked their lives not just for coin, but for the delicate balance of Ma'at itself. Of all the jobs you could imagine in ancient Egypt, there's one that stands out as both baffling and mildly tragic: the professional armpit sniffer. Yes, while some lucky souls got to carve statues of gods, write hieroglyphs in elegant script, or strut about in temples chanting prayers, others spent their working hours pressing their noses into someone else's sweaty linen tunic. And they did it not once, not twice, but for hours on end, all in the name of hygiene and quality control. You see, Egypt was hot. Blisteringly hot. Add to that the fact that bathing wasn't an everyday routine for most people, and you end up with a civilization that took body odor very seriously indeed. Smells weren't just an inconvenience, they carried moral, medical, and even spiritual weight. A foul odor was associated with illness, impurity, or spiritual imbalance. A pleasant fragrance, on the other hand, suggested health, wealth, and divine favor. Perfumes and scented oils weren't luxuries reserved for elites, they were woven into the fabric of daily life. And someone, somewhere, had to make sure those scents were doing their job. Enter the sniffers. Their role was to test perfumes, oils, and sometimes even the actual bodies of the wealthy to ensure freshness. Imagine a nobleman preparing for a banquet. His servants dress him in fine linen, daub him with oils, and then call over the household sniffer to perform the final check. Yes, my lord, your left armpit is suitably fragrant with myrrh, but the right one could use another dab of lotus oil. A mortifyingly intimate quality control process, but essential to maintaining the noble's image of refinement. This wasn't just about vanity. Egyptians believed that pleasant scents pleased the gods. Temples burned incense daily, and priests purified themselves with fragrant oils before rituals. For a ruler or noble to smell sweet was not only a social expectation but also a religious one. A foul-smelling official risked offending both humans and deities. And so the sniffer wasn't merely a servant with an unfortunate job, they were an essential link in the chain of cosmic order. The role also tied into the booming perfume industry. Egypt was famous throughout the ancient world for its fragrances. Myrrh, frankincense, cinnamon, lotus blossom, and cedarwood were blended into ointments, oils, and balms. Entire workshops were dedicated to perfume production, with recipes passed down through generations. Before a batch was deemed worthy of export or temple use, someone had to test its potency. That's right, there were sniffers in the labs as well as in the palaces. Picture rows of workers grinding resins and flowers, while one unlucky apprentice huffs away at each jar, too weak, too sour, that one's divine. The occupational hazards were obvious. First, there was the constant exposure to strong odors. While some oils were pleasant, others were pungent enough to make eyes water. An overexposure dulls the senses, so a sniffer risked nose fatigue. Imagine explaining to your boss that you couldn't smell their armpit properly today because your nostrils had clocked out. Worse still, some resins and oils could irritate skin and sinuses, meaning the job came with a steady background of headaches and sneezes. Then there was the social awkwardness. While embalmers were both respected and feared, sniffers probably inspired a different kind of reaction. It's hard to build a commanding reputation when everyone knows you spend your day sniffing aristocrats. One imagines the jokes practically wrote themselves. Oh look, here comes the nose of the Nile. Yet, despite the ridicule, their work mattered. Egyptians placed enormous value on scent, and a noble whose odor offended could quickly find themselves the subject of gossip, mockery, or divine disapproval. Of course, there's always the question of how one became a sniffer. Was it a punishment? An apprenticeship gone wrong? Or perhaps, in some cases, a family trade? My father sniffed your father's armpits, and now it is my honor to sniff yours. Grim thought, but in a society where trades often pass down generations, it's not implausible. On the other hand, maybe some sniffers began as perfumers' assistants, their noses proving so sensitive they were promoted, or demoted, depending on perspective, to the role of quality assurance. Humor aside, there's a deeper symbolism here. Smell in Egypt wasn't just physical, it was spiritual. A clean scent meant closeness to the gods, while foulness hinted at decay and corruption. By ensuring the noble classes smell divine, sniffers were helping uphold ma'at, that balance and harmony so central to Egyptian belief. In their own way, they were guardians of spiritual hygiene, even if their day-to-day reality was more nose in armpit than lofty cosmic duty. And if you think this job was uniquely Egyptian, think again. Variations of the sniffer role cropped up in other cultures too. Ancient Chinese courts had testers for breath and body odor. Medieval Europe had perfumers who doubled as testers for wealthy patrons. But Egypt stands out for how central smell was to religion and culture, making their sniffers not just servants but semi-ritual specialists. Picture it now, a noble striding proudly into a banquet, reeking of lotus and myrrh, while in the shadows, a weary sniffer rubs their sore nose and mutters, "Another day, another pit." Not glamorous, not enviable, but undeniably weird, and absolutely Egyptian. Now, brace yourself. If armpit sniffing seemed unglamorous, welcome to the next rung down the occupational ladder, dung collecting. Yes, in ancient Egypt there were entire families whose livelihood revolved around gathering animal droppings. While today we politely label such people's waste management professionals, the Egyptians had no such euphemisms. You were, quite simply, the dung man. At first glance, it sounds like a miserable existence. Traipsing through streets and fields with baskets, stooping to scoop up whatever the cows, donkeys, goats, and geese had left behind. And yet, here's the surprising part. Dung was one of the most valuable resources in Egypt. Without it, fields went barren, kilns went cold, and houses went without bricks. In a land where every scrap of material had to be used wisely, animal waste was less a nuisance and more a cornerstone of civilization. Electric light bulb dung as fuel. Let's start with the hearth. Egypt had little in the way of woodlands, which meant firewood was scarce. You couldn't run an entire civilization on the occasional acacia branch. The solution? Dry dung. Once gathered, shaped into flat patties, and left to bake in the scorching sun, it became an excellent fuel source. Bakers, brewers, and potters relied on it daily. So every time someone enjoyed a loaf of bread or a jar of beer, they were indirectly thanking the humble dung collectors who'd provided the eco-friendly energy source. Imagine the irony. A noble enjoying his evening feast might sneer at the lowly dung man trudging past his estate, all the while forgetting that the very bread on his plate had been baked with the help of dried manure. Truly, the foundations of civilization are never as glamorous as we'd like to think. Seedling fertilizer for fields. But dung's value didn't stop at the oven. It was also a vital fertilizer. Nile floods replenished soil annually, but the land still needed enriching between inundations. Farmers mixed animal dung into their fields to improve crop yields. Without it, harvests faltered, and famine loomed. So in a very real sense, the collectors weren't just waste gatherers. They were agricultural enablers, the unseen hands keeping Egypt's breadbasket full. Building material. And then there's construction. One of Egypt's most common building materials was mud brick, simple, sturdy, and perfect for houses, walls, and even palaces. But raw Nile mud alone wasn't strong enough. It needed binding. Enter dung once again, mixed into the mud to give bricks cohesion and durability. Yes, many an Egyptian home was held together, quite literally, by excrement. When you picture those elegant mud brick villages and palatial estates, remember the dung men who provided the key ingredient. Scales # social position. So how were dung collectors viewed? With a mixture of disdain and dependence. On the one hand, their work was dirty, smelly, and considered low status. They probably lived on the fringes of villages, their baskets never quite free of odor. On the other, everyone needed their services. Farmers relied on them, bakers needed them, and builders depended on them. It's a classic case of society quietly sneering at the very people it couldn't survive without. It's also worth noting that dung collection was often a family trade. Children grew up learning to scoop, dry, and shape patties, just as the children of scribes learned their hieroglyphs. This wasn't a temporary odd job. It was a generational livelihood, passed down like any other craft. Faced with tears of joy, humor, and reality. Now, imagine the gallows humor. You're trudging down the street with a basket of manure while your neighbor brags about his son becoming a scribe. That's nice, Neberman, you mutter, but when your bread stops baking, remember who's really holding civilization together. One imagines dung collectors developing thick skins and a quick wit, laughing at the absurdity of being indispensable yet ridiculed. Religious and ritual elements. Even religion found uses for dung. Temple fires sometimes burned dried patties, and some rituals included offerings prepared with dung-fueled flames. In their roundabout way, the collectors were feeding the gods as well as the people. Of course, no priest was about to call them holy men, but the connection was there nonetheless. Warning sign # occupational hazards. Naturally, the job wasn't without risks. Handling waste meant exposure to bacteria, parasites, and unpleasant infections. Cuts and sores could easily fester. Add to that the sheer physical labor of carrying heavy loads under a blazing sun, and you had a recipe for exhaustion. Yet, for all that, dung collection remained steady work. Crops would always grow, animals would always graze, and people would always need fuel. Job security, if nothing else, was guaranteed. Trophy unsung heroes. So while the scribes get celebrated for their learning, and the priests for their piety, let's spare a nod to the dung men of Egypt. Without them, no bread would bake, no beer would brew, and no houses would stand. They were, in their smelly, unglamorous way, the glue that held Egypt together. Quite literally, in the case of those bricks. Death in ancient Egypt wasn't a quiet, somber affair with muted tones and polite sniffles. It was an event, a public spectacle, a performance designed to honor the dead, appease the gods, and reassure the living that the cosmic order remained intact. And like any performance, it required actors. Enter the professional mourners, women employed to cry, shriek, tear their hair, and generally make a racket at funerals. Now, one might ask, why hire someone to wail when the deceased's family could surely cry for free? The answer lies in Egyptian belief and social ritual. Grief wasn't just an emotion, it was a duty. Loud, visible mourning was considered essential to honor the dead and ensure their safe passage into the afterlife. The more dramatic the display, the more respect was shown. If the family couldn't muster the necessary volume or tears, whether because they were emotionally restrained, too exhausted, or perhaps not particularly fond of the deceased, professionals were brought in to fill the gap. These women weren't amateurs. They were skilled performers, trained in the art of grief. Their repertoire included sobbing, wailing, tearing their garments, rolling in dust, and smearing ashes on their faces. Some even cut their hair or scratched their cheeks until they bled, visual proof of the intensity of their sorrow. It was theatre, but theatre with teeth, painful, messy, and very convincing. The most prestigious mourners took on the roles of the goddesses Isis and Nephthys, who, according to myth, lamented the death of Osiris. By embodying these divine sisters, mourners transformed funerals into sacred reenactments of cosmic drama. Their cries weren't just noise, they echoed the original lament that restored Osiris and kept the cycles of life and death in balance. To have professional mourners present was to link your loved ones passing directly to the most powerful myth in Egyptian religion. Of course, not every mourner could claim divine association. Many were simply talented performers who earned their keep by moving from funeral to funeral. Picture a bustling necropolis with mourners on call, waiting to be hired. Yes, the Smith family needs 2 wailers for Tuesday. Can you manage? It was a trade like any other, with reputations made or broken on the strength of one sobbing. Payment might come in the form of food, beer, or small coins, depending on the family's means. For grand funerals, mourners could expect decent wages, perhaps even gifts of clothing or jewelry. For poorer burials, the payment might be more modest, a loaf of bread, a jug of beer, and the satisfaction of having performed a spiritual duty. Still, it was steady work. People died with regularity in ancient Egypt, and funerals were constant. But the job wasn't without its challenges. For one thing, crying all day is physically exhausting. Try forcing out convincing sobs for hours under the blazing sun, surrounded by incense smoke and grieving relatives. Your throat grows raw, your eyes swell, your nose runs. And there's no nipping behind a curtain to dab your face and sip some water. You were expected to maintain the performance continuously, because the gods and the neighbors were watching. Then there's the emotional toll. Even if the grief was staged, mourners immersed themselves in the atmosphere of death daily. They were exposed to sorrow, ritual lament, and the smell of embalming compounds on a regular basis. It must have been draining, not to mention the constant proximity to corpses and tombs, which carried a cultural taint of impurity. Professional mourners, much like embalmers, lived in a liminal social space, necessary and respected in ritual, but perhaps avoided in casual company. And yet, despite the hardships, some mourners probably took pride in their craft. They were the soundscape of grief, the visible proof of devotion. A funeral without mourners might be seen as dishonorable, even shameful. Imagine the gossip. Did you hear? Nebet's burial had no wailers. Clearly her family didn't care. Hiring mourners wasn't just a spiritual investment, it was social insurance against such whispers. Interestingly, the role of professional mourner survives in many cultures today. In parts of the Mediterranean, Asia, and Africa, hired mourners still appear at funerals, crying and singing laments. It's a tradition thousands of years old, and Egypt provides some of the earliest evidence of its practice. So next time you see a depiction of two women at the foot of a sarcophagus with their hands raised in grief, know that they might not just be grieving relatives, they might be the ancient equivalent of funeral contractors. It's worth pausing to consider the paradox here. In a society so focused on the afterlife, funerals were as much about the living as the dead. The mourner's job wasn't just to ease the deceased into eternity. It was to comfort, impress, and reassure the community. Their shrieks told everyone, yes, this person mattered. Yes, they will be remembered. And yes, the proper rituals have been performed. In that sense, mourners were guardians of memory, their voices echoing far beyond the tomb. So, while we may smirk at the idea of paid crying, the truth is that these women performed a sacred service, blending performance, spirituality, and social necessity into one of the strangest, yet most human, jobs of the ancient world. If professional mourners provided the soundtrack of sorrow in ancient Egypt, entertainers were the counterbalance, filling banquets, festivals, and royal courts with laughter, music, and spectacle. And among these entertainers, one group stands out in particular: dwarfs. In Egypt, being small wasn't seen as a disadvantage. In fact, dwarfs often enjoyed unique status, sometimes rising to positions of prestige at the heart of palace life. Multiple musical notes entertainment as a profession. Entertainment wasn't a side hobby for bored villagers, it was a profession. Banquets, for example, weren't just about eating and drinking. They were full-blown sensory experiences, with music, dancing, juggling, acrobatics, and storytelling. Pharaohs and nobles prided themselves on hosting lavish parties, and entertainers were indispensable. Imagine a grand hall lit by oil lamps, the smell of roasted goose and incense in the air, while musicians plucked lutes, dancers spun in linen skirts, and acrobats somersaulted between courses. For ordinary entertainers, this might have been exhausting but rewarding work. You performed in exchange for food, drink, and sometimes payment in goods or coin. You might travel between households, temples, and festivals, developing a repertoire that kept you in demand. And while you weren't on the same level as scribes or priests, you weren't without respect either. After all, you brought joy, and joy had its place in Ma'at, the balance of life. Crown dwarfs at court. But dwarfs held a special role. Unlike in some other ancient cultures, where physical differences were ridiculed or stigmatized, Egyptians often regarded dwarfs as possessing magical or divine qualities. Their distinct appearance was thought to connect them to the gods, particularly Biz, the dwarf deity of music, fertility, and household protection. As a result, dwarfs were not merely entertainers, they were seen as lucky charms, guardians, and sometimes even ritual specialists. Pharaohs often kept dwarfs in their courts, sometimes entrusting them with valuable roles such as guarding jewelry or acting as companions to royal children. In tomb paintings, dwarfs are shown leading pet monkeys, dancing, or participating in household activities. Far from being marginalized, they were woven into the very fabric of elite life. One famous example is Seneb, a dwarf who rose to prominence during the Old Kingdom. Far from being a background figure, Seneb held significant titles, owned land, and was buried in his own lavish tomb near the pyramids of Giza. His statue, depicting him with his average-sized wife and children, is one of the most touching and human portrayals to survive from ancient times. Zeneb's success shows that dwarf entertainers could parlay their unique status into genuine influence. Monkeys, music, and mischief. Dwarfs weren't the only entertainers with unusual responsibilities. Sometimes they were paired with animals, such as monkeys trained to perform tricks. Picture a dwarf entertainer juggling while a monkey in a miniature kilt somersaulted at their side, to the delight of a banquet hall full of half-drunk nobles. It sounds absurd, but Egypt thrived on spectacle, and such performances reinforced the power and wealth of the host. Music was central to these entertainments. Harps, flutes, sistrums, rattles associated with the goddess Athor, and drums filled the air. Dancers often performed in groups, their movements carefully choreographed, while singers recited humorous or bawdy songs. Some entertainers specialized in satire, gently mocking their patrons without overstepping into insult. Imagine the careful balancing act: make the pharaoh laugh, but not at his expense. Fail, and you might not be invited back. Magical associations. What makes dwarfs particularly fascinating is how their roles straddled entertainment and spirituality. Because of their perceived magical qualities, they were sometimes given responsibility for protective rituals, especially around childbirth. Dwarfs associated with the god Biz were thought to ward off evil spirits, ensuring safe deliveries and healthy children. In that sense, they were entertainers by night, guardians by day. This dual role gave them a respect uncommon for entertainers in other cultures. While a juggler might fade into obscurity, a dwarf could secure lasting patronage, wealth, and even a place in the historical record. Their uniqueness made them both indispensable and memorable. Scales / social status. So how did entertainers fare socially? Their status was ambiguous. On one hand, they were servants of the elite, dependent on patronage and vulnerable to mockery. On the other, they provided essential services, joy, ritual protection, and in the case of dwarfs, genuine prestige. They could be both celebrated and dismissed, exalted and ridiculed, often at the same time. Yet for many, this was preferable to a life of field labor or dung collecting. Better to sing, dance, and juggle for nobles than to spend your days ankle-deep in manure. Performing art's the bigger picture. Entertainers remind us that ancient Egyptian life wasn't just about toil, ritual, and death. There was also space for laughter, play, and creativity. The presence of dwarfs in particular shows the Egyptians' capacity to weave difference into their religious and social fabric in a way that granted unique opportunities. Where we might see oddity, they saw divine favor. So, the next time you picture a pharaoh reclining on a couch with a cup of wine, remember that nearby there might have been a dwarf cracking jokes, a monkey stealing grapes, and a dancer rattling a sistrum in time with the beat, all essential threads in the tapestry of Egyptian life. If you thought working for a pharaoh meant wielding power, whispering in corridors, and dining on delicacies, think again. For some, a royal appointment meant a career spent either wafting a feather fan or babysitting a pair of sandals. Yes, in ancient Egypt, entire professions existed around keeping the ruler cool and making sure his footwear didn't wander off. Blowing wind face / fan bearers. Let's begin with the fan bearers. Egypt is hot. Scorching, breath-stealingly hot. Imagine standing in a stone palace under the midday sun, weighed down by layers of linen, jewelry, and possibly a wig coated in beeswax. Now imagine being the pharaoh, sitting in splendor but sweating like everyone else. What's the solution? A human air conditioner, the fan bearer. The fans were no ordinary trinkets. They were massive, often made of ostrich feathers mounted on long poles. To wield one was to perform both a practical and a ceremonial role. Practically, you kept your master cool. Symbolically, you projected an aura of majesty. The swaying feathers created an image of divine presence, as if the pharaoh were literally surrounded by the breath of the gods. In art, fan bearers appear as dignified figures, their ostrich plumes framing the ruler like halos. It wasn't necessarily an easy job. Holding a feather fan aloft for hours required strength and stamina. Your arm would ache, sweat would drip, and you dared not falter. To let the pharaoh overheat was not just negligence, it bordered on sacrilege. Yet, despite the drudgery, being a fan bearer could be surprisingly prestigious. The proximity to the pharaoh meant access to royal audiences, the possibility of overhearing secrets, and the chance to build influence. In some periods, the title fan bearer at the right hand of the king was an honor bestowed upon important officials, not mere servants. So while some fan bearers were lowly attendants, others leveraged the role into positions of genuine power. Sandal guards. Now, let's move to something even stranger, the sandal guards. In Egyptian culture, sandals were both practical and symbolic. Made of leather, papyrus, or palm fiber, they protected feet from the hot sand, but they also marked status. A pair of finely made sandals could signify wealth and refinement. And the pharaoh's sandals? Well, they weren't just footwear, they were royal regalia, which meant someone had to look after them. The title keeper of the king's sandals actually appears in Egyptian records. It sounds ridiculous to modern ears, but in practice, it was an honorable role. Guarding the sandals wasn't about stopping someone from nicking them out of the wardrobe. It was about ensuring that the symbols of kingship were always ready, polished, and in their proper place. Sandals were often depicted as part of ceremonial scenes, sometimes inscribed with the names of Egypt's enemies so that, symbolically, the pharaoh was trampling them underfoot. To mishandle the royal sandals was to mishandle propaganda itself. Imagine the daily routine: you rise early, check the condition of the sandals, perhaps rub them with oil, and present them ceremoniously when required. You then stand nearby, holding them until needed, watching over them like a hawk. Hours pass. Banquets come and go. And still, your entire responsibility is footwear. Glamorous? Hardly. But proximity to the pharaoh gave you opportunities most farmers could only dream of. Scales hash prestige in triviality. The curious thing about both jobs is how trivial they seem to us, yet how meaningful they were to the Egyptians. In a culture obsessed with ritual, symbolism, and hierarchy, no detail was too small to be sanctified. Fanning the pharaoh wasn't just cooling him down, it was upholding Ma'at, ensuring the king appeared divine and untouchable. Guarding his sandals wasn't just about shoes, it was about reinforcing his dominance over Egypt's enemies. For the men who held these posts, the work might have been monotonous, but it was steady, safe, and occasionally lucrative. Better to guard sandals in the palace than to break your back hauling stones in the desert. And who knows, perhaps a loyal sandal bearer could catch the pharaoh's eye, rising to more influential roles. After all, if he could be trusted with shoes, perhaps he could be trusted with more. Face with tears of joy the human comedy. Of course, one can't help but imagine the comic possibilities. Picture two sandal guards bickering over whose job it was to polish the straps, or a fan bearer losing grip mid-ceremony and clonking the pharaoh on the head with an ostrich plume. Did accidents happen? Almost certainly. And when they did, you can bet the gossip spread like wildfire. Did you hear? The king nearly roasted yesterday because his fan bearer fainted. What disgrace! Classical building hash the bigger picture. These roles highlight how Egyptian society transformed even the most mundane tasks into sacred duties. What we see as absurd, shoe guarding, fan waving, they saw as integral to kingship. It speaks volumes about the centralization of power in the pharaoh's person. Every aspect of his being, from his sweat to his sandals, was tied to cosmic order. Keeping him cool and properly shod was, therefore, not trivial, but essential. If you thought fanning a pharaoh or sniffing noble armpits sounded peculiar, spare a moment for the frog catchers. Yes, there were people in ancient Egypt whose entire livelihood revolved around hunting frogs, lizards, and other small creatures. It might sound comical, but these humble critter wranglers played a surprisingly important role in religion, medicine, and even the dinner table. Frog-face frogs and fertility. Frogs weren't just swamp-dwelling nuisances. They were symbols of fertility, tied to the goddess Hecate, who was depicted with a frog's head. She was associated with childbirth and rebirth, so frogs became powerful ritual symbols. Midwives and healers sometimes used frog amulets or invoked their imagery to encourage healthy pregnancies. Naturally, this meant frogs were collected for religious use, sacrificed, or preserved as offerings. Someone had to provide the temples with a steady supply, i.e. the frog catchers. It wasn't a glamorous career. Imagine trudging along the marshy banks of the Nile, trousers rolled up, basket in hand, squelching through mud in search of croaking little prizes. Armed with nets or nimble fingers, frog catchers grabbed as many as they could, piling them into baskets bound for temples or markets. The job was wet, smelly, and unending. Frogs breed in staggering numbers during flood season, which meant business boomed, but so did the noise. A frog catcher's ears must have rung constantly with a chorus of ribbits. Turtle other critters, lizards, birds, and insects. Frog catchers often doubled as general animal providers. Lizards, snakes, and certain birds were gathered for rituals, medicines, or as food for sacred animals. Even scarab beetles were collected in vast numbers, later carved into amulets or buried as offerings. Imagine the monotony of spending your day crouched in the sand, scooping up beetles while muttering that your cousin at least got to sniff perfumes instead. Some animals went straight to the temples. Sacred ibis birds, cats, and crocodiles required food, and small animals helped fill the menu. Others went into medicine. Egyptian medical papyri are filled with recipes involving obscure ingredients, powdered lizard tail, frog skin, or crushed beetles mixed with honey. Whether these concoctions actually worked is debatable, but demand meant someone had to gather the raw materials. Pot of food culinary uses. Not all animals ended up as offerings or potions. Some were simply eaten. Frogs and certain fish were considered delicacies in some regions, though the elite often looked down on such fare as food of the poor. Still, in lean times, frogs were a practical protein source. Animal catchers who sold their wares at market helped keep bellies full, even if few diners wanted to dwell on the source of their supper. Scales / social standing. Frog catchers and animal providers were at the bottom of the social ladder. Their work was dirty, their earnings meager, and their odor questionable. Yet, paradoxically, they were indispensable. Temples could not function without them, healers needed their supplies, and families occasionally relied on their catches for food. Like dung collectors, their role reveals how Egyptian society transformed necessity into employment, no matter how unglamorous. One imagines the frog catchers forming their own subculture. Children learning the tricks of scooping wriggling frogs without being bitten. Wives sighing as baskets of croaking, squirming creatures were dumped at the door. Husbands coming home caked in mud, muttering about priests who complained that the frogs were too small this week. A profession few envied, but many relied upon. Smiling face with open mouth and cold sweat, the humor of it all. It's hard not to smile at the absurdity. Imagine a nobleman solemnly receiving a frog as part of a fertility charm, blissfully unaware of the poor catcher who'd spent the morning knee-deep in muck to provide it. Or picture a healer grinding beetles into paste while complaining about their supplier's lack of consistency. Honestly, these scarabs are half the size of last week's. How am I meant to cure insomnia with this? And then there's the sensory side. Temples must have echoed with the croaks of frogs awaiting sacrifice. Frog catchers themselves must have been perpetually damp, their hands perpetually slimy. A less glamorous existence is hard to imagine, yet without them, Egyptian ritual, medicine, and even cuisine would have faltered. Globe showing Europe-Africa symbolism and the cosmic order. As odd as the job seems, it fit neatly into Egyptian cosmology. Frogs, lizards, and beetles weren't random creatures, they embodied divine principles. Frogs meant fertility, scarabs meant rebirth, snakes meant protection. By supplying these animals, catchers were participating in maintaining Ma'at, the cosmic order. Their muddy labor in the marshes linked directly to the sacred cycles of life, death, and renewal. So while frog catching might appear laughably weird to us, in its own way, it was as essential as embalming or farming. It kept temples stocked, healers equipped, and myths alive. Not bad for a job that started with a muddy basket and a sharp eye. When we imagine ancient Egypt, our minds tend to drift toward pyramids, temples, golden masks, and solemn priests chanting beside flickering oil lamps. What we don't picture, and what most history books politely gloss over, is what happened when someone had to answer the call of nature. Yes, even pharaohs, nobles, and priests had to relieve themselves. And in a world without modern plumbing, someone had to keep things vaguely civilized. Enter the toilet attendants, the unsung heroes of sanitation in ancient Egypt. Restroom men and women toilets in ancient Egypt. First, a quick survey of Egyptian facilities. For the elite, toilets often took the form of limestone seats set over sand-filled pits or containers. These could be placed indoors, sometimes even in separate rooms of larger houses. For ordinary folk, it was far simpler: clay pots, communal areas, or open fields near the edge of villages. Public toilets did exist in certain cities, especially around work sites like pyramid constructions, but they were rudimentary. Now, picture those seats and pots without a sanitation system. Waste didn't magically vanish down pipes. Someone had to empty it, clean it, replace the sand, and carry the foul contents off to, well, somewhere. This is where toilet attendants came in. Pile of feces the job description. Toilet attendants managed both private and communal facilities. Their duties included emptying pots and containers, replacing the sand or ash used to absorb odors, cleaning limestone seats or clay jars, carrying away collected waste, often to be repurposed as fertilizer in fields. Yes, even human waste was recycled. Nothing went to waste in Egypt, and what the dung collectors did with animal droppings, toilet attendants extended to human deposits. Warning sign # occupational hazards. Needless to say, the job came with hazards. Handling excrement in hot conditions meant constant exposure to bacteria and parasites. Dysentery, worms, and infections must have been occupational companions. Attendants probably carried the scent with them everywhere, their hands never quite clean despite endless scrubbing in the Nile. One imagines neighbors wrinkling their noses when they walked past. And yet, the work was crucial. Poor sanitation leads to disease outbreaks, even in ancient societies. By removing waste, attendants kept households and communities healthier, even if no one thanked them for it. Crown toilets for the elite. The pharaohs and nobility had attendants of their own. Imagine being tasked with caring for the king's personal facilities. On one hand, the prestige of serving the pharaoh could elevate your status. On the other, your career highlight consisted of emptying a royal pot. Still, Egyptian art and documents make it clear that even rulers had practical needs. The role of toilet attendant at court might have been more honorable than in the villages, but the core task was exactly the same. There are even stories from later periods of servants helping their masters during the act itself, handing them cloths or water for cleansing. If that was the case in Egypt, then some attendants were not just cleaners but personal hygiene assistants. Truly intimate service, though not the kind anyone would brag about. Face with tears of joy the humor factor. The sheer indignity of the role must have sparked humor. Imagine being introduced at a banquet, and this is Parseer, keeper of the chamber pot. A title guaranteed to provoke snickers. And yet, behind the jokes lay grudging respect. Everyone needed sanitation. Everyone depended on attendants to carry away yesterday's goose and beer. Amphora religion and purity. There was also a ritual angle. Purity mattered in Egypt. Priests cleansed themselves daily before temple service, sometimes even shaving their entire bodies to avoid impurity. Waste, as a source of impurity, required careful handling. Toilet attendants, by removing it, helped maintain a sense of ritual cleanliness. Their work, however unglamorous, contributed indirectly to the sacred order. Scales # social standing. Unsurprisingly, toilet attendants occupied a low rung in the hierarchy. They weren't celebrated like scribes or embalmers. They didn't earn the peculiar prestige of crocodile keepers or the magical aura of dwarfs. They were, however, necessary. Like dung collectors, they provided a service without which society would falter. And in a pragmatic civilization like Egypt, necessity always created a niche. Globe showing Europe-Africa the bigger picture. The existence of toilet attendants reminds us that even the most sophisticated ancient society still had to grapple with the universal realities of human biology. The pyramids may inspire awe, but they were built by workers who also needed latrines. Temples may resound with hymns, but their priests still required chamber pots. And behind the glamour of Egypt's splendor, there were always attendants with buckets, quietly ensuring that civilization didn't collapse under its own weight. If you caught a cold today, you'd probably grab some paracetamol, drink tea, and grumble. In ancient Egypt, however, medicine was never just about herbs or practical remedies. It was about magic. And so, tucked between the ranks of doctors and priests, there existed a peculiar group of professionals whose job was to heal the sick, lift curses, and chase away demons. These were the magical healers, part pharmacist, part shaman, part exorcist. Amphora medicine and magic. Egyptians didn't draw a clear line between medicine and magic. Illness was thought to have many causes: bad food, foul air, angry gods, or malicious spirits. A toothache, for instance, could be explained by the presence of a worm wriggling inside the tooth, an idea surprisingly common in the ancient world. The cure? A mixture of herbs and a spell. Both were considered essential. This meant healers needed to know their ingredients: honey for wounds, garlic for infections, willow bark for pain relief, but also the proper incantations. The Ebers Papyrus, one of the oldest medical texts, is full of both recipes and rituals. You might smear resin on a wound while chanting, "Begone, evil spirit, leave this flesh." Imagine today's GP mixing antibiotics with a bit of theatrical exorcism. That was the Egyptian way. #hash roles and responsibilities. Magical healers often worked in temples but also roamed villages. Their toolkit included herbal knowledge, mixing ointments, poultices, and potions. Spells and charms, recited over patients to ward off illness. Amulets, scarabs, frog figures, and other tokens blessed to provide protection. Exorcism rituals, scaring away spirits thought to cause disease. Some healers specialized in childbirth, invoking the goddess Hecate or Biz to protect mothers and infants. Others focused on snake bites and scorpion stings, constant hazards in Egypt. There were even curse breakers, summoned when someone suspected that envy or malice had invited disaster into their household. Face screaming in fear, the business of fear. Curses were serious business in Egypt. Words were believed to have power, and malicious spells could supposedly cause misfortune, infertility, or death. To counteract them, curse breakers performed elaborate rituals. They might inscribe protective spells on papyrus, bury figurines, or spit and trample on clay effigies of the suspected culprit. In essence, they fought magic with more magic, a sort of ancient arms race of curses and counter-curses. Imagine the drama. A villager storms into the healer's hut. My crops have withered, my goats are lame, and my neighbor keeps smirking at me. I've been cursed. The healer solemnly nods, reaches for a frog amulet, and begins chanting while burying a doll in the sand. Whether the crops revived is questionable, but the villager probably left feeling reassured and a few bread loaves poorer. Scales # social status. So where did magical healers stand in society? Higher than dung collectors, certainly, but not on par with scribes or priests. They occupied a strange middle ground. On the one hand, their work was respected and necessary. People flocked to them in desperation. On the other, they were sometimes viewed with suspicion. Too much dabbling in magic could edge dangerously close to sorcery, which was frowned upon if it seemed subversive. Still, many healers earned steady livelihoods. Some even worked for temples or elites, blending their services with religious authority. If you were a priest trained in both rituals and medicine, you could command real respect, moving easily between sacred duties and healing the sick. Face with tears of joy the oddities of practice. There's also no denying that some remedies sound bizarre to modern ears. Consider the following cures found in Egyptian texts. For baldness, smear the head with a mixture of crocodile fat and hippopotamus dung. For headaches, place a fish on the patient's head and recite a spell. For bedwetting, feed the child a roasted mouse. It's easy to laugh, but to the Egyptians, these practices weren't silly. They were part of a holistic system where symbolism mattered as much as practicality. A mouse, after all, might symbolically scurry away with the problem. Globe showing Europe-Africa the cosmic context. The magical healer's role ultimately reflects Egypt's worldview, a cosmos where the physical and spiritual were inseparable. To heal the body, you also had to heal the soul. To protect the village, you had to fight unseen forces. These healers were the bridge between everyday ailments and the eternal struggle between Ma'at, order, and Isfet, chaos. Person with praying hands, respect and ridicule. Did people laugh at them? Perhaps in private. Imagine neighbors joking about someone who just paid a healer to bury a frog in the garden as protection against evil eyes. But when illness struck, skepticism quickly gave way to desperation. In a world without antibiotics or vaccines, a healer with herbs and spells was better than no one at all. Trophy the legacy. The strangest thing is how much of their practice endures. Even today, many cultures combine medical treatment with charms, prayers, and rituals. The Egyptian magical healer would probably nod knowingly at our own reliance on placebo, ritual, and belief. If there is one thing the ancient Egyptians adored almost as much as their gods, it was food and drink. Bread and beer weren't just staples, they were life itself, consumed daily by peasants and pharaohs alike. But when it came to the royal household, food was more than sustenance. It was political, ceremonial, and sometimes deadly. Which is why entire professions existed to prepare, test, and sometimes sacrifice themselves for the pharaoh's supper. Bread, beer, and banquets. Egyptian banquets were feasts for the senses. Roasted geese, honey cakes, figs, dates, onions, garlic, cucumbers, lentils, and endless loaves of bread, always accompanied by jugs of beer and wine. Pharaohs and nobles dined lavishly, with whole kitchens devoted to their appetites. Behind the scenes, an army of bakers, brewers, cooks, butchers, and servers kept the food flowing. But in a world where poison was a very real threat, not everyone got to eat in peace. The Royal Food Tasters. Enter the Royal Food Taster. Their job description was brutally simple: eat what the pharaoh was about to eat. If they keeled over, well, that meant the dish was poisoned. If they survived, the pharaoh could tuck in with confidence. Hardly the most reassuring career path. Imagine showing up for your first day of work, staring at a plate of suspicious stew, and thinking, this could literally be my last meal. It wasn't only about poison, either. Food tasters also checked for quality, flavor, and freshness. Pharaohs demanded the best. Serving stale bread or sour beer could be interpreted as disrespectful, or worse, as negligence. So the food taster had to be discerning, able to detect subtle changes in taste, texture, and aroma. A sensitive palate might save not just their life, but also their employers. Was the job prestigious? Oddly enough, yes. To be a food taster meant close proximity to the pharaoh, access to royal banquets, and, if you survived long enough, the potential to win favor. But prestige came with peril. One imagines food tasters developing an almost superstitious relationship with their meals, muttering prayers before each bite. Beer the brewers. On the other side of the kitchen were the brewers, whose task was both more pleasant and more universal. Beer was the drink of the masses, consumed daily at every level of society. It was thick, nutritious, and packed with calories, more like liquid bread than the golden lager we imagine today. Workers were often paid in beer rations, while nobles drank finer, filtered varieties flavored with dates or honey. Brewing wasn't simple. It required soaking bread loaves, fermenting them with yeast, and carefully controlling the mixture. Breweries employed teams of workers, often overseen by women, who ground grain, baked loaves, and managed fermentation vats. In temple complexes, brewing also had a sacred dimension. Beer was offered to the gods, and festivals often revolved around heavy drinking. For brewers, the work was steady but labor-intensive. Grain had to be hauled, water fetched, and vats stirred. The smell of fermentation filled the air, and accidents weren't uncommon. Still, brewers were indispensable. Without them, society would grind to a halt. Imagine pyramid construction crews going on strike because their daily beer ration had been delayed, something that very likely happened. Scales hash life and death in the kitchen. Together, food tasters and brewers highlight the strange duality of Egyptian sustenance. On one hand, it was sacred and celebratory, tied to festivals, offerings, and royal banquets. On the other, it was risky and political. A poisoned cup or tainted loaf could change dynasties overnight. Food tasters lived with constant anxiety. Brewers, meanwhile, lived with constant hard work. Yet both were woven into the same web of necessity. One ensured the pharaoh survived his meals, the other ensured everyone else had enough to eat and drink to function. Face with tears of joy the humor of it. It's hard not to laugh at the absurdity of the food taster's plight. Imagine biting into a roasted duck and pausing dramatically, while everyone else in the banquet hall watches to see if you collapse. Or the brewer, slaving over vats of beer, listening to nobles grumble that it's too sour this year, while workers cheerfully guzzle down gallons of the same batch. Globe showing Europe-Africa symbolism and status. Both roles also carried symbolic weight. Food tasters acted as shields, their bodies a buffer between the pharaoh and treachery. Brewers embodied abundance, their craft tied to fertility and prosperity. In both cases, what looks like menial labor becomes, in Egyptian eyes, part of the cosmic balance of Ma'at. Nourishment, safety, and celebration were not trivial, they were pillars of order. Trophy unsung heroes. So, while we marvel at golden thrones and colossal statues, let's not forget the men and women who risked indigestion or worse for the pharaoh's dinner, or those who spent their lives brewing the beer that fueled both gods and laborers. Without them, Egypt's glittering civilization would have been hungry, thirsty, and, quite possibly, short-lived. When we think of ancient Egyptian construction, we imagine sweating laborers hauling blocks, architects sketching grand plans, and overseers barking orders. But lurking quietly in the background were people whose tasks sound so absurdly specific that they verge on parody: sand sifters and dust counters. Yes, some Egyptians earned their bread by filtering sand and, in certain contexts, by quite literally counting dust. Amphora, why sand mattered. Sand wasn't just something that got into your sandals and annoyed you for weeks. It was a fundamental part of Egyptian building, art, and ritual. Sand was used in foundations, in casting bronze, in smoothing stone, and in creating molds for everything from amulets to coffins. It was also employed in burial rituals, where its purity symbolized rebirth. With such importance, it had to be the right kind of sand. And someone had to make sure it was properly sifted, free of stones, shells, and lumps that might ruin the mixture. Cue the sand sifters. Their job was to shovel sand into large sieves, shake it until only fine grains passed through, and collect the results. Day in, day out. Imagine the monotony: shoveling, shaking, sifting, all while the desert sun hammered down. Not glamorous, but essential. A badly made mold or a weak brick could bring down an entire project, and nobody wanted to be the man responsible for a cracked sarcophagus lid. Counting dust. If sifting sounds tedious, spare a thought for the dust counters. In the pursuit of cosmic order, Egyptians sometimes measured out sand or dust with almost obsessive precision. Rituals demanded exact quantities, and construction projects required precise leveling. Ancient texts describe surveyors spreading sand evenly across work sites to level the ground. Who ensured the sand was smooth, measured, and even? The dust counters. Their task could involve weighing, measuring, and yes, sometimes literally counting portions of dust or sand grains in ritual contexts. It wasn't about tallying every grain, thank goodness, but about symbolically demonstrating control over chaos. To count and measure dust was to impose order on what seemed infinite, a very Egyptian mindset. Imagine being trained for this. Your father sits you down and says, "Son, our family has counted dust for generations. It is noble work. Here, take this little bowl and start practicing." The mind boggles. Building construction hash on the construction site. On major building projects, sand sifters and counters worked alongside masons, surveyors, and laborers. They prepared sand for mortar, for smoothing stone surfaces, and for creating level foundations. They might also help in bronze casting, where sifted sand lined molds to prevent imperfections. Precision was everything. A flaw in a bronze tool or a temple statue was not merely embarrassing but potentially offensive to the gods. Scales # ritual importance. Beyond construction, sand and dust had ritual meaning. Priests used sand in purification ceremonies, spreading it on temple floors or mixing it with water for cleansing. The act of counting, measuring, or arranging sand was imbued with symbolic weight, order imposed upon chaos. To modern eyes, it looks like mind-numbing busywork. To Egyptians, it was cosmic housekeeping. In burial practices, too, sand had significance. Graves were often filled or lined with carefully sifted sand to symbolize rebirth. Dust counters may have been employed in these contexts to ensure the right amount was used. Imagine standing at the edge of a grave, solemnly sprinkling measured handfuls of sand, all the while knowing you'd spent years perfecting the art of getting it just right. Faced with tears of joy, the human sighed. It's hard not to chuckle at the image of someone complaining about their lot. You think your job is boring. At least you get to sniff armpits or wrestle crocodiles. Me? I count dust. All day. Every day. Perhaps the sand sifters developed their own gallows humor, making bets on who could sift the most in an hour, or mocking overseers who demanded finer sand, purer dust, more precision. Globe showing Europe-Africa cosmic symbolism. But beneath the humor lies something telling about Egyptian society. Their obsession with detail extended to every corner of life. Nothing was too small to be ritualized. If dust symbolized chaos, then counting it restored order. If sand symbolized rebirth, then sifting it purified the material. These tiny, thankless jobs reflected the Egyptian worldview. Every grain mattered in the balance of Ma'at. Trophy unsung precisionists. So while no one composed hymns to the sand sifters or carved statues of the dust counters, their work quietly underpinned the grandeur of Egypt's monuments. The pyramids may dazzle us, the temples inspire awe, but without someone ensuring the sand beneath was fine, level, and symbolically pure, the whole edifice could quite literally have crumbled. Of all the strange professions in ancient Egypt, few provoke such a mix of fear, fascination, and revulsion as tomb robbing. To us, it sounds like the work of petty criminals. But in ancient Egypt, it was often a structured, semi-professional activity, sometimes involving whole gangs with inside knowledge. And where there were robbers, there were also curse testers, individuals willing to brave supposed magical punishments to see whether the way was clear. Together, they formed one of the weirdest underground economies of the ancient world. Coffin # the allure of gold. Egyptian tombs were irresistible targets. Pharaohs and nobles were buried with treasures, jewelry, amulets, furniture, food, even whole chariots, all intended to serve them in the afterlife. To a struggling laborer, the sight of gold and lapis lazuli sitting untouched in the desert sands must have been maddening. Why break your back hauling stones for bread when you could make a fortune in one night with a chisel and a torch? The irony, of course, is that tombs were designed to deter thieves. Hidden shafts, false doors, sealed entrances, and elaborate curses inscribed on walls, all aimed to protect the dead. But no system is foolproof. Many tombs, even of great pharaohs, were plundered within decades of burial. Tomb robbing became so rampant that entire trials were recorded in papyri, detailing gangs of workers, guards, and even priests caught in the act. Hammer and wrench # the robber's toolkit. Professional tomb robbers didn't just stumble into crypts. They had skills and equipment, chisels, ropes, lamps, and sometimes even official knowledge of layouts from disgruntled builders. A group might spend nights digging through limestone, silently hauling away rubble, hoping not to alert guards. The work was dangerous. Collapse, suffocation, or discovery meant death. Yet for some, the rewards outweighed the risks. Inside the tomb, they stripped mummies of jewelry, smashed open coffins, and ransacked storerooms. The brutality is shocking to us, but for the robbers, the goal was survival. They melted down gold, sold artifacts discreetly, and spent the proceeds on food, beer, or bribes. Face screaming in fear the fear of curses. And then there were the curses. Egyptians firmly believed that disturbing the dead could bring divine retribution, blindness, boils, madness, or death. Tomb inscriptions often warned intruders, "He who disturbs this tomb shall have his neck twisted like a goose." To a superstitious worker, such threats were terrifying. Which is where the curse testers came in. These individuals, sometimes part of the robbers' gang, sometimes hired outsiders, were the ones who went in first. Their job was to test whether the curse was active. Perhaps they muttered prayers, threw pebbles inside, or even placed a small animal at the threshold to see if it survived. If the tester entered and nothing happened, the rest of the gang followed. If the tester dropped dead, likely from falling rock, foul air, or sheer terror, the others considered the curse proven. It sounds absurd to us, but to them, it was deadly serious. Imagine drawing the short straw and being told, "Congratulations, tonight you're testing the Pharaoh's curse. Try not to die." Scales # the legal and social cost. Tomb robbing was considered one of the gravest crimes in Egypt. It wasn't just theft, it was sacrilege. To violate a tomb was to deny someone their afterlife, a crime against both the deceased and the gods. Those caught faced brutal punishments, beatings, mutilation, exile, or execution. Entire gangs were put on trial, their confessions recorded under torture. Some were burned alive, their ashes scattered as a warning. And yet, despite the risks, tomb robbing persisted. Poverty and desperation drove people to gamble with their souls. It became so common that even officials and priests were implicated, betraying their duty for a share of treasure. Face with tears of joy the human comedy. There must have been moments of dark humor, too. Picture a gang arguing over who should test the curse first, or a thief sneezing in the dusty tomb and sending everyone fleeing in terror, convinced the gods had struck. Or imagine a poor curse tester bravely walking in, only to trip over a rock, prompting his companions to bolt before realizing he'd merely stubbed his toe. Globe showing Europe-Africa symbolism and order. What makes this profession fascinating is how it reveals the tension in Egyptian life between reverence and desperation. On the one hand, tombs embodied the very essence of eternity and Ma'at. On the other, Hunger and inequality drove people to defy that order. Tomb robbers and curse testers lived at the boundary between survival and sacrilege, embodying both the fragility of social norms and the ingenuity of those who bent them. Trophy legacy. Ironically, modern archaeology owes much to tomb robbers. Many tombs were first breached by ancient thieves, their damage providing clues for later excavations. Without their illicit work, some treasures might never have come to light. In a strange twist, the very people cursed and despised in their time helped preserve fragments of Egypt's past for us. If you've ever been to a concert and noticed the hype man urging the crowd to clap along, or watched a modern TV show with canned applause, you've seen a faint echo of a role that existed thousands of years ago in ancient Egypt. Because yes, the Egyptians actually had professional clappers and applause leaders, people whose entire careers revolved around making noise at the right moment. Multiple musical notes, rhythm and ritual. Egyptian society revolved around rhythm, not just musical rhythm, but the rhythm of life itself, the Nile's floods, the cycles of sowing and harvest, the rituals of worship. Music, dance, and performance were woven into festivals, processions, and ceremonies. And while instruments like harps, flutes, and sistrums, sacred rattles, provided melody, someone still needed to set and hold the beat. That's where clappers came in. Clappers used simple wooden or ivory sticks, sometimes carved in the shape of hands, animals, or gods. Striking them together produced sharp, steady sounds. Their job was to mark time, keeping dancers in sync, guiding chants, and energizing processions. In temples, clappers helped punctuate hymns. At festivals, they rallied crowds into a shared rhythm of joy. Imagine a procession for Osiris winding through the streets, priests carrying statues, musicians playing, dancers twirling, and in the middle, clappers striking in unison, their beats echoing like a heartbeat through the city. Without them, the whole spectacle would lose its cohesion. Clapping hands signed the applause leaders. Beyond rhythm, there were those whose task was to generate enthusiasm. These applause leaders acted as cheerleaders of the ancient world. At royal appearances, festivals, or banquets, they were strategically placed to clap, shout praise, and encourage others to join in. Their well-timed bursts of noise helped create an atmosphere of awe and celebration. Think of them as ancient applause signs. When the pharaoh emerged, the applause leaders cried out life, prosperity, health, and clapped furiously, prompting the crowd to echo. Their noise wasn't just flattery, it reinforced the pharaoh's divine aura. Silence could be dangerous, it might suggest indifference or discontent. The applause leaders ensured no such awkwardness occurred. Scales hash sacred and secular. Clappers weren't just for entertainment. They also had sacred functions. In funerary rituals, clappers marked the transition between chants, their rhythms echoing the heartbeat of rebirth. In temple dances honoring Atha, the goddess of music and joy, clappers maintained rhythm so that devotion never faltered. The sharp clack of wood was a sound of order, aligning human action with cosmic balance. In secular life, clappers appeared at banquets and celebrations, supporting dancers and musicians. Some may even have traveled with entertainers as part of their troupe. Others likely specialized in temple duties, their clappers stored carefully until festival days. face with tears of joy the comic side. Of course, it's hard not to grin at the thought of someone spending their whole career clapping. Imagine explaining it to your family. Yes, Father, I found my calling. I am a professional clapper. Or picture a weary clapper complaining, my hands ache, my ears ring, but at least Pharaoh looked pleased. One wonders whether crowds ever grew tired of applause leaders. Did villagers mutter, "Oh no, here comes Nebbit again, telling us when to clap"? Or perhaps the leaders developed flamboyant styles, competing to see who could whip up the loudest cheer. Globe showing Europe-Africa symbolism of noise. Noise itself had symbolic power in Egypt. Loud clapping, shouting, or drumming was thought to repel evil spirits. In some rituals, clappers weren't just keeping time, they were actively driving away chaos. To Egyptians, sound was not trivial. It shaped reality. So, the professional clapper wasn't just a human metronome, they were part of the cosmic defense system. Classical building # social status. Where did these noisemakers sit in the hierarchy? Likely near the bottom. They were essential but not prestigious. Yet, they enjoyed moments of influence. At festivals, their beat set the tempo for entire crowds. At royal events, their claps were among the first sounds the pharaoh heard. While their wages were modest, bread, beer, and perhaps the odd coin, their presence was indispensable. Trophy legacy. Clappers and applause leaders remind us that even the act of making noise can be professionalized, ritualized, and woven into the machinery of power. Their clapping wasn't random, it was structured, meaningful, and socially vital. They were the pulse of ceremonies, the amplifiers of royal glory, and, at times, the protectors against evil through sheer sound. So, next time you find yourself in a theater audience being coaxed into applause, remember, you're participating in a tradition as old as ancient Egypt, when clappers with carved sticks and applause leaders with booming voices orchestrated joy in the shadow of temples and pyramids. When you think of a zoo, you probably imagine children pressing their noses to glass while keepers feed giraffes or lions. Now, transpose that idea back 4,000 years to ancient Egypt, except instead of children, you have priests, and instead of casual animals, you have gods. Because in Egypt, animals weren't just creatures, many were living embodiments of deities. Which meant they needed caretakers, handlers, and sometimes even full-blown temple zookeepers. Cat-faced cats, crocodiles, and more. Certain animals were especially sacred. Cats, associated with the goddess Bastet, were revered as guardians of the home and symbols of fertility. Ibises represented Thoth, the god of wisdom. Falcons embodied Horus, the sky god. Crocodiles were linked to Sobek, a powerful deity of the Nile and military might. Bulls, jackals, baboons, and snakes also held divine associations. In some temples, a single animal, such as a bull believed to be the living Apis, was treated as a divine king. It was fed, housed in splendor, and adored by pilgrims. Elsewhere, entire colonies of animals were maintained to provide offerings and mummifications. Archaeologists have uncovered vast catacombs filled with mummified ibises, cats, crocodiles, and more, proof of an industry dedicated to raising and embalming creatures for ritual use. Glass of milk daily duties. So what did the animal keepers do? Their daily routine would sound familiar to any modern zookeeper, albeit with a spiritual twist. Feeding sacred animals with carefully selected food. Cleaning and maintaining enclosures. Grooming animals, particularly cats and bulls, to keep them healthy and presentable. Assisting in rituals where animals appeared as living embodiments of gods. Preparing surplus animals for sacrifice and eventual mummification. Imagine being responsible for a crocodile lounging in a temple pool. You'd have to ensure it was fed with fish, but also keep it calm enough not to snack on priests. Or think of tending a colony of ibises, their beaks clicking and wings flapping, while knowing they would one day be offered in vast numbers. Warning sign # perks and dangers. The job had both perks and perils. On the plus side, animal keepers worked closely with priests, enjoyed steady employment, and were seen as performing sacred duties. To care for a divine embodiment was an honor, however humble the task. On the minus side, it was dangerous. Crocodiles, snakes, and even bulls could be unpredictable. A careless moment might cost you a hand, a limb, or your life. Unlike professional mourners or clappers, animal keepers faced very real physical risks alongside their ritual responsibilities. Ox the API's bull. The API's bull deserves special mention. Regarded as the living incarnation of Ptah, later linked with Osiris, the API's bull lived in Memphis under priestly supervision. When it died, it was embalmed with great ceremony and entombed in the Serapeum, a necropolis of massive sarcophagi. Keepers of the API's bull weren't just handlers, they were custodians of a god in flesh. Their job combined animal husbandry with divine stewardship, a uniquely Egyptian blending of the mundane and the sacred. Face with tears of joy the human side. Despite the lofty symbolism, one can't help but picture the humorous side. Imagine a priest solemnly intoning hymns to Horus while a sacred falcon suddenly decides to relieve itself on his shoulder. Or picture crocodile keepers grumbling about how their god snapped up yet another bucket of fish before they even tipped it into the pool. Perhaps animal keepers developed rivalries, each boasting about their charges. My cats are more divine than your ibises. Oh please, everyone knows crocodiles are the true gods. Scales / social standing. In the social hierarchy, sacred animal keepers sat somewhere between servants and minor temple staff. They weren't priests themselves, except in the highest roles, such as the API's bull caretakers, but they were close enough to the divine to enjoy a measure of respect. At the very least, they were safer from mockery than dung collectors or frog catchers. After all, who would dare insult the man feeding Sobek's crocodile? Globe showing Europe-Africa symbolism and the cosmic order. Animal keeping underscores the Egyptian obsession with merging the divine and the everyday. To us, feeding a bird or a cat is routine. To them, it was cosmic maintenance. By tending sacred animals, keepers helped sustain the bond between gods and humans. Their labor wasn't just about food and cages, it was about ensuring that gods remained visibly present in the world. Trophy legacy. The sheer scale of animal mummification is staggering. Archaeologists estimate that millions of animals were raised, killed, and embalmed over centuries. Behind that industry were countless anonymous keepers, whose lives revolved around feeding, cleaning, and managing divine creatures. They remain unsung, but without them, the vast animal cults of Egypt could never have functioned. When you picture an ancient Egyptian, chances are the image in your head is of almond-shaped eyes rimmed with black kohl, smooth brown skin gleaming with oil, and a sleek black wig perched perfectly on the head. That picture isn't just an accident of Hollywood imagination, it's rooted in reality. Egyptians were obsessed with appearance, and behind every flawless face and carefully crafted hairstyle were professionals, the makeup artists and wig makers of the Nile. Lipstick, the art of makeup. For the Egyptians, makeup wasn't merely cosmetic. It was medicinal, protective, and spiritual. Black kohl around the eyes reduced glare from the desert sun and kept flies away. Green malachite eyeshadow was linked with healing and divine protection, particularly from the god Horus. Red ochre applied to lips and cheeks wasn't just about looking attractive, it symbolized vitality and health. The makeup artist's job, then, wasn't simply to beautify. It was to safeguard. They ground minerals into fine powders, mixed them with animal fat or oils, and carefully applied them with sticks or brushes. They might spend hours perfecting the dramatic lines that extended beyond the corners of the eyes, creating the look we instantly associate with Egypt. Imagine the pressure. One smudged line and your noble client looks less like a goddess and more like she's had a sleepless night. Perfection was expected, and the best artists were in demand at court, temples, and festivals. Tools and techniques. The makeup kit was surprisingly sophisticated. Palettes carved from slate or alabaster were used to grind pigments. Applicators ranged from reed brushes to ivory sticks. Ointments were stored in small jars of faience or glass, some shaped like animals or flowers. Scented oils doubled as skin treatments and perfumes, keeping skin supple in the dry climate. The makeup artist was part chemist, part painter, part ritual specialist. Recipes required precision. Too much galena, a lead compound used in kohl, and the mixture could be toxic. Too little, and it lacked the protective effect Egyptians valued. Balance mattered, and the artist was the guardian of that balance. Woman # the world of wigs. Hair was equally important. The hot climate and prevalence of lice meant many Egyptians shaved their heads, especially the elite. But baldness wasn't fashionable. Enter the wig specialists. These artisans crafted wigs from human hair, wool, or plant fibers, creating elaborate styles for both men and women. Wigs weren't just practical, they were statements of status. A simple cropped wig might serve for daily wear, while long braided wigs, sometimes perfumed with cones of scented wax, were reserved for banquets and festivals. Priests, meanwhile, wore specific styles for rituals, reinforcing their role as intermediaries with the divine. The wig maker's workshop must have been a hive of activity, bundles of hair being sorted, strands woven onto linen caps, artisans carefully braiding and styling, perfumers melting wax cones to be affixed on top. The final product could take days to assemble, and the finest wigs were treasured possessions, sometimes buried with their owners. Scales # beauty as order. To Egyptians, beauty wasn't vanity. It was ma'at, order, balance, harmony. A well-painted face and a properly styled wig reflected cosmic stability as much as personal grooming. Looking put together was a duty, especially for the elite, who represented Egypt's ideals. Makeup artists and wig makers weren't just serving fashion, they were maintaining the very fabric of order. Face with tears of joy the lighter side. Of course, even in such a refined trade, mishaps must have happened. Imagine a wig slipping off mid-banquet, revealing a sweaty bald patch, or a priest frowning as a coal line smudged during a procession. Perhaps artists grumbled about their clients, she insists on extra green malachite, but it makes her look like a startled frog. And one can't help but picture young apprentices practicing on each other, ending up with faces so heavily painted that they resembled caricatures of divine statues. Classical building / social standing. Where did these artisans sit in society? Higher than frog catchers and toilet attendants, certainly, but below scribes or priests. They were skilled professionals, often attached to elite households or temples. The very best could enjoy patronage from nobles, earning steady incomes and perhaps gifts of jewelry or clothing. Some wig makers even inscribed their names on their products, proud of their craftsmanship. Globe showing Europe-Africa legacy. Their influence endures. When we think of ancient Egypt today, it's their artistry that comes to mind, the eyeliner, the wigs, the polished appearance of gods and mortals alike. Without them, our mental image of the civilization would look utterly different. Makeup artists and wig specialists remind us that even in antiquity, image was everything. They turned everyday faces into icons, blending health, beauty, and spirituality into one of the most recognizable styles in human history. In our modern world, people may turn to psychologists, astrologers, or self-help books for answers about life's mysteries. In ancient Egypt, they turned to dream interpreters and omen readers. These specialists made a living by unraveling the cryptic messages believed to come from the gods, hidden in dreams, the flight of birds, or even the twitch of an eyelid. To the Egyptians, nothing was random. Every event, no matter how small, was a potential sign. Crescent moon, the power of dreams. Dreams carried immense weight in Egyptian culture. Sleep was seen as a liminal state, the soul could wander, encounter gods, or glimpse the future. Dreams were portals to divine wisdom, and interpreting them required trained specialists. These interpreters relied on dream books, papyrus texts that listed common dream scenarios and their meanings. For instance, dream of drinking warm beer, sickness is coming. Dream of eating crocodile meat, victory over enemies. Dream of losing teeth, death or misfortune in the family. Dream of a cat, betrayal or bad luck. One surviving text, known as the Ramesside Dream Book, provides hundreds of such entries. The dream interpreter's role was to match the dreamer's report to the closest entry and advise accordingly. Picture a nervous villager waking at dawn, rushing to the interpreter with a troubling vision, "I dreamt of a snake coiled in my bed." The interpreter strokes his chin, consults his scroll, and declares, "It means you will gain protection, provided you bring an offering to the temple of Wadjet." A neat combination of reassurance and business opportunity. Flying bird omen reading. Beyond dreams, omen readers looked for signs in the natural world. Birds in particular were considered messengers of the gods. The direction of their flight, their calls, even their behavior could be interpreted. If a falcon soared overhead before a journey, it was a sign of favor from Horus. If crows cawed at the city gates, it might foretell unrest. Other omens came from less glamorous sources. A twitching eyelid, a sudden sneeze, or the stumble of a donkey might all be read as warnings or promises. Interpreters were expected to recognize these subtle cues and weave them into coherent guidance. Classical building temple and village roles. Some interpreters worked within temples, attached to cults where dreams and omens were part of official ritual. Pilgrims might sleep in temple courtyards, hoping for dreams sent by the gods, which priests would then interpret. This practice, called incubation, blurred the line between medicine and divination. A sick person might receive both a dream interpretation and a herbal remedy. Others operated more informally in villages, offering their services for bread, beer, or small fees. These grassroots interpreters were part of everyday life, consulted for everything from farming decisions to marriage prospects. Scales status and respect. Dream interpreters held a curious position in society. They weren't quite priests, but they carried spiritual authority. Their advice could shape decisions, soothe fears, or spark action. For ordinary Egyptians, their guidance provided comfort in a world full of uncertainty. At the same time, skepticism likely existed. Imagine a farmer muttering, "The interpreter told me my dream of geese meant wealth, but all I got was more geese." Still, belief in divine messages was strong enough that most people were willing to pay for reassurance. Face with tears of joy the human comedy. It's hard not to imagine the humorous side. Picture an interpreter trying to stay serious while a villager recounts, "I dreamt of wrestling a hippopotamus while wearing my mother's wig." Or the awkwardness when a dream book gave only grim options, "You dreamt of broken pottery?" "Ah, well, perhaps it means your household will fall apart." Sorry about that. There must also have been creative liberties. If the dream book didn't fit, interpreters likely improvised, spinning the symbols into something useful and profitable. A clever interpreter could always find a way to connect dreams to offerings at the local temple. Globe showing Europe-Africa symbolism and cosmic order. Dream and omen interpretation reveals Egypt's profound belief in order. To them, nothing was meaningless. Every dream, every bird, every twitch had significance. Interpreters acted as translators between the divine and the human, imposing meaning on chaos. Their work gave people a sense of control, reinforcing the balance of Ma'at. Trophy legacy. The fascination with dreams and omens didn't die with Egypt. Greek and Roman cultures inherited many of these practices, and even today, people consult horoscopes, tarot readers, or psychologists for dream analyses. The Egyptian interpreters were part of a long tradition of humans seeking meaning in the mysterious. So while their job might sound strange, earning bread and beer by decoding other people's nightmares, it was deeply human. After all, who among us hasn't woken from a vivid dream and wondered, what does it mean? Every civilization has its unsung organizers, the people who track the days, regulate the seasons, and remind everyone else when it's time to plant, pray, or party. In ancient Egypt, this task fell to the timekeepers and calendar watchers, professionals whose job was to observe the heavens, track the Nile, and keep society synchronized with the cosmos. At first glance, this might not sound like a weird job. After all, calendars and timekeeping are practical necessities. But in Egypt, the work took on peculiar dimensions, combining astronomy, religion, and bureaucracy in ways that could only have arisen in the land of the Nile. Sun with face watching the sky. The Egyptians were keen sky watchers. Stars, the sun, and the moon weren't just celestial objects, they were gods, their movements messages. Timekeepers charted the rising of stars, especially Sirius, known to them as Sopdet. Its heliacal rising, when it first appeared on the horizon before dawn, signaled the annual flooding of the Nile. This was the cornerstone of the agricultural cycle, and the timekeeper's ability to predict it was nothing short of life-saving. By tracking the heavens, they divided the year into 12 months of 30 days each, plus 5 epagomenal days devoted to the birthdays of major gods. Timekeepers thus created not just a farming schedule but a cosmic order. Hourglass with flowing sand measuring hours. Within each day, time itself was measured in creative ways. Egyptians used sundials, water clocks, and star charts to divide day and night into hours. But these hours weren't fixed like ours. Summer daylight hours stretched longer, winter hours shrank. Imagine telling a friend, "I'll meet you in 3 hours," and having that mean something entirely different depending on the season. Timekeepers had to explain and enforce this system, translating cosmic rhythms into daily life. Their work was hardly glamorous. Long nights might be spent staring at stars, recording positions with painstaking care. Days might involve adjusting water clocks, filling jars, and measuring how long it took for liquid to drip from one vessel to another. Precision mattered. Priests needed the exact hour for rituals, farmers needed the right season for sowing, and pharaohs demanded auspicious dates for coronations and battles. Scroll bureaucracy of the cosmos. The calendar watchers weren't free-spirited stargazers. They were part of the state machinery. Temples employed them to determine festival dates, ensuring ceremonies aligned with cosmic cycles. Bureaucrats relied on them for tax collection, tied to harvests and floods. Even legal documents used calendar dates, meaning scribes needed the watchers' data to draft contracts and decrees. One can imagine the pressure. If a timekeeper miscalculated the Nile flood, crops could fail and famine could loom. If they set a festival at the wrong time, priests might declare the ritual invalid. And if they declared an unlucky day auspicious, blame might fall squarely on them. Scales hash luck and the calendar. The Egyptian calendar also designated certain days as lucky or unlucky. Dream interpreters might guide individuals, but it was the calendar watchers who codified which days were favorable for travel, weddings, or even haircuts. Entire households planned their lives around these rulings. For example, don't start a journey on the 13th day of the month of Atha, it's unlucky. Thus, the calendar watchers controlled not only farming and ritual but also personal decisions, embedding themselves deeply in daily life. Face with tears of joy the comic side. There must have been humorous frustrations. Imagine a villager cursing under his breath, "I can't harvest today because the calendar watcher says it's unlucky." Meanwhile, the grain's rotting in the field. Or priests complaining, "We can't start the festival until the watcher confirms it's the 5th hour, and his water clock just sprang a leak." Picture apprentices grumbling as they hauled heavy water jars in the heat, also their master could count drips into a bowl while muttering about the flow of time. It may have been sacred work, but it was still sweaty, tedious, and occasionally ridiculous. Globe showing Europe-Africa symbolism and order. Beneath the quirks, though, the timekeepers embodied Egypt's obsession with Ma'at, order, harmony, balance. Time itself was sacred, part of the divine rhythm that kept chaos, Isfet, at bay. By watching stars, measuring water, and noting floods, these professionals aligned human life with cosmic patterns. To the Egyptians, they weren't just bureaucrats, they were guardians of eternity. Trophy legacy. The legacy of Egypt's calendar keepers is profound. Their solar calendar, with 365 days, influenced later Greek and Roman systems and is the ancestor of our modern year. Their water clocks and sundials were precursors to mechanical timekeeping. In their pursuit of order, they helped create some of the foundations of science. Yet, at heart, they were also people with a peculiar job, staying up all night to watch stars, counting drips in jars, and telling farmers when to sow wheat. Both cosmic and comical, their role captures the essence of Egypt's strangest professions, the merging of the mundane and the divine. Party Popper Epilogue, a world of strange work. From armpit sniffers to curse testers, from frog catchers to applause leaders, Egypt's weird jobs remind us that no civilization, no matter how glorious, runs on glamour alone. It runs on people. People willing to fan the pharaoh, feed the crocodile, smear the coal, or count the dust. Each odd job reveals a truth: Egyptians turned even the most trivial task into part of a cosmic system. Work wasn't just survival. It was woven into religion, status, and eternity. And that's why their civilization, more than most, still fascinates us.